Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink, it is time for some Path of Exile discussion. Today I wanted to go through all 40 challenges for patch 3.24, outline how they're beaten, and also help you formulate a plan for whatever your goals are in this league. So if your goal is to go for 35 challenges or 38 challenges, you'll be able to skip a couple of challenges, and I'll help you formulate a plan for which ones are likely to be your best choices for the ones you want to skip. It's worth noting that the 40th challenge in the list that used to be called Endgame Grinds, this one is actually quite a bit easier than it's been in recent time, but at the same time there's a couple of challenges that are fairly nasty this league as well. I did want to start with a couple of notes though in general. This is an easier set of challenges than most leagues have been, but it's not one of the easiest of all time. I think the easiest ones we've ever had are probably 3.17, 3.21 and 3.8, and you could debate the order of those, but this is probably in the easiest 10. That said, some of these do require doing some difficult content. Two of the challenges require precision kills of difficult bosses. One of them requires complex interactions with the league mechanics. None of them are extreme RNG or extreme grinds, but a number of them are fairly nasty grinds, and one of them is fairly nasty RNG, so I'll point those ones out when we get to them. But there's nothing in this lot that's truly heinous. Now, I'm not covering Ruthless in this video, except just to state that if your goal is to get the rewards for 38 challenges, the path of least resistance for you is to disregard the existence of Ruthless. Although this is the easiest league so far for getting 8 of 8 in Ruthless, it's still no joke, and it's likely going to take longer than getting 38 of 40, and probably actually longer than getting 40 out of 40 in what Ruthless players term Bench League. Now, I think that for most players, your path of least resistance, if your goal is to get 38 challenges, is going to be to skip over unfamiliar undertakings and Arimor's Apex. This may not be the case for every individual player, but I do think that that's probably the easiest set of 38 challenges to do. And if you're inexperienced with Uber Pinnacle bosses, you might find that Arimor's Apex is easier than Colossal Conditionals, which is the one that requires you to do Uber Pinnacle bosses in various tricky ways. Grueling Gauntlet Grinds, the 40th challenge on the list, is easier than usual this league, and if you don't normally level to 100, all you need to do is kill Argus 100 times, which is honestly a miserable experience. It sucks the fun out of the game for an hour, but it is something that you can get done in an hour if that's your goal. Alternately, you can level to 100 instead, which just requires discipline to not do risky content for a while so that you don't end up dying. Now, one thing that stands out, and you'll see this when we go into every single challenge in detail, is that past league mechanics are a pretty significant focus here. There's some fairly grindy past league mechanic challenges. Only one of them is particularly heinous, and that's Masterful Monsters, but a lot of the rest of them are fairly grindy. We're talking things like fighting 60 Harbingers, doing 100 rituals, harvesting 100 plots, and so on and so forth. You really don't want to be in a situation where you've still got 5 of these to do and you're finished with the league, so I suggest that you go for a bit of variety in some of the content you're running in order to get on with some of these. In every list of challenges, there's a number that are extremely straightforward. You look at it and you say, okay, I already understand what I need to do here, even if you're not someone that knows a lot about Path of Exile. I'm going to bundle 11 of those challenges together. Note that these are not necessarily all easy challenges. In fact, one of them requires beating the Feared with 70% zone quantity in play, so quite a lot of invitation mods present. That's not an easy fight, but it's very straightforward as to what to do, and if you're struggling with that, what you're looking for there isn't really a guide to the challenges, it's a guide to making your character stronger, and a guide to the mechanics of the Feared fight, which is sort of outside the scope of this video. Anyways, the ones that I want to just quickly brush over and mention them, but not really go into any big detail. Beginner Basics, which is something you'll get by accident by the time you're in Act 3. Act Adversaries 1 and 2, which require you to complete the core storyline of the game. Deadly Deeds, which you'll get by accident within about 15 maps or so. Regrettable Requests, which is straightforward, just going back to earlier acts and doing some of the quests you might have otherwise skipped. These are the ones that grant you respec points. There's Achieving Ascension, which is defeating the 4th Labyrinth. There's Alternate Atlases, which requires you to get 100 Atlas bonus, and this is the one I'm considering the last of the easier ones. Even though you're going to need to beat a fair number of corrupted red maps to do that, it's all going to be pretty straightforward as always to see what's next on the agenda. After that, you've got Sanctified Scarabs 1 and Map Magnificence. These are quite grindy. In fact, Map Magnificence is very, very, very grindy, but they're also very straightforward. Complete tier 16 maps that are affected by Scarabs for the first one, and for the second one, just complete a lot of maps. One thing that can speed you up here is knowing that Foundry map is the fastest map on the Atlas at the moment. All you need to do in order to run through Foundry map is just never turn. Just run in a straight line from the time you enter the map, and it's about 20 meters or so until you get to the map boss. Contrast to something like Strand, which is also a pretty straight line, although a bit windier than Foundry, and it's something like 50 meters until you get to the boss. It's a lot further than Foundry map is. And finally there's Otherworldly Obstacles, which is the hardest of this lot, and Favoured Figments, both of which require you to beat the Feared, the former with 70% item quantity. No joke there, you need a fairly strong character to do it, but everything involved in them is straightforward, and that's the reason we're jumping past these ones quickly. The next category of challenges are ones that are just Necropolis League Mechanic Fundamentals, but that are also either self-explanatory or that you pretty much just do by accident. So these are picked out as the ones you'll get in initial experimentation with the League mechanic. Necrotic Necessity, you are going to complete this by Act 2, assuming that you go to the graveyard when you get an itemized corpse, and you use it essentially as though it's an alchemy orb or an essence in order to just generate a good rare item for your character at the time. Significant Spirits will happen without trying by about level 75, and Devout Disciples will come for free as well, just by killing random monsters. Again, you'll probably get this about the time you hit level 75, maybe before. The first challenge that requires a little discussion is Peddler's Produce 1. Now the Chromatic Orb and Jeweler's Orb recipes, I've included them on the screen at the moment, but they're ones that you'll get by accident just by playing the game. The Hybrid Flask one requires you to go to a vendor and sell them a Life Flask and a Mana Flask of the same tier, and it also has to be a tier that has a Hybrid Flask. Additionally, you'll also need to throw in a Fusing Orb. A good option here is just to go to one of the early act vendors and grab the requisite Life Flask and Mana Flask from them, and then vendor it with a Fusing Orb. Now the Instilling and Enkindling Orbs, there's recipes for both of these, and I've included the one for the Instilling Orb here. It is to vendor 2 Enkindling Orbs, cast when damage taken support, or for that matter any other support gem that has the trigger tag on it, and an Alchemy Orb. These 4 items will give you 1 Instilling Orb. Now there is somewhat of a mirror version of this where you get an Enkindling Orb. I think from memory it's 3 Instilling Orbs, 1 Trigger Gem, and an Orb of Scouring. It's something along those lines, but it's not particularly important. The Instilling one is easy enough to do, especially because you only need to do it once. The next category that we've got is things relating to past leagues. Now we're just going to go through these in the order they appear in the challenge sheet, so Enigmatic Essences, Abyssal Assailants, and then there's many more of them afterwards. The Abyss one is really straightforward here. 10 maps with an Abyss set up on your Atlas will get it. If you're not interested in speccing into Abyss, you can also get this just by throwing Scarabs at it. You can throw classic Abyss Scarabs into maps, and you will find that you'll get all of the parts of this done in reasonably short order. The Essence one requires a little bit more knowledge about it. Part 3 of this challenge almost absolutely requires the use of Essence Scarab of Ascent. There are ways that you can get there without it, but practically you're going to need that. You're also going to need to do it in tier 6 and above maps, and then every time you get 3 Shrieking Essences on a monster, you're definitely going to want to throw a Remnant of Corruption on it. It is possible to get 3 Shrieking Essences on a monster without using that Scarab, and then upgrade them all with a Remnant of Corruption, so you can do this without it, but practically you're probably going to need those Scarabs. Secondly is the requirement to defeat a map boss that is possessed with 6 essences in a red or purple tier map. Now forget doing this in a purple tier map, this is one that's going to be at its easiest in a tier 11 map that is scoured. What you want to do here is allocate Crystal Resonance on your Atlas, and then fill up your other Scarab slots with classic Essence Scarabs. So when I refer to a classic Scarab, I mean the one that doesn't have anything more about it. So we're not talking Essence Scarab of Ascent, we're talking just the item that's called Essence Scarab here. Crystal Resonance is a pretty sketchy node to have on your Atlas, so keep that in mind. You might want to unspec that after you've completed this, you only need to do that once. Next in past league mechanics we've got Divine Domination and Tactful Thievery. They're both very straightforward and they just require briefly speccing into the relevant mechanic. What I really like about the one that says kill 50 map bosses while you're under the effect of a shrine, this one is encouraging you to combine a destructive play strategy with a shrine strategy. These two things go well together, and so that's something that's worth keeping in mind. For the heist component here, one of the requirements is to complete item level 78 or above priceless or precious contracts. This will be about 30% of the contracts that drop without speccing into them on the Atlas. And if you're interested in going harder on heist, you might spec friends in high places on your Atlas, at which point it'll be something like 40% of the contracts that you find in maps that will qualify for that. The heist one this league is very, very quick. Note that to complete a 4-wing blueprint, you need to succeed on the 4th wing. So you need to exit the heist successfully holding the curio from that one. The other 3 wings don't seem to matter. And when I say the 4th wing, I don't mean the rightmost one on the blueprint, I just mean the one that you enter 4th. Okay, so when we're talking about these past league mechanics, the 5th of these is Heralding Harbingers, and this one is a real pain point if you're a solo self-found player. All of this is easy except for Assemble a Harbinger unique. In trade, it's a trivial nuisance. You'll need to purchase things like the first piece of directions, second piece of directions, third piece of directions, and once you own them all, you combine them together, essentially treating them all as jigsaw puzzle pieces or Tetris pieces in your inventory, and once they're all in the right layout, they'll fuse together into one item. That is the step of assembling a Harbinger unique. In solo self-found though, you'll end up with a problem. You'll end up with the wrong pieces at the wrong time. Here, there is a divination card that can help with this. This divination card is named the Messenger. It drops from Port Map, it drops from Crystal Ore Map, and what I would suggest that you consider doing is running Searing Exarch aligned mapping on those two maps. I honestly think that that may be the path of least resistance if your goal is to complete this potentially awful challenge when playing in solo self-found. Now, Harbinger Orbs drop from a few different places. Delve drops them in enormous numbers, Ritual drops them in enormous numbers, and of course Harbingers drop them in reasonable numbers as well. You'll need to use a Harbinger's Orb, and when you do that, you'll have about a 20% chance for that map to turn into the Beachhead unique map, and so you're likely going to need about 15 of these Harbinger's Orbs. You also get a modest number of them from Heist as well. So there's a lot of different ways that you can do this, but you're going to need a very large number of Harbinger's Orbs if you're going to assemble a Harbinger unique the base way, because it's going to take a lot of beachheads in order to get a complete set, or it's going to take a lot of Searing Exarch mapping, or it's going to take a lot of port maps, or it's going to take a lot of crystal ore maps. Essentially, if you're in solo self-found, I don't believe that this is on your path of least resistance to 35 challenges. It is on your pathway to 38, but it's not on your pathway to 35, so do keep that one in mind. In trade though, just bypassing this step is going to cost you 50 chaos. Rounding out the rest of the past league focused ones, we have Rapturous Rituals and Hungering Harvests. These are the mainline ones for past league mechanics. The ritual one is straightforward except for the fourth part, which requires you to complete a single ritual encounter that has at least 6 unique map bosses. The easiest way to do this is to run the Glacier map, where you can actually get all 9 of the map bosses into a bottle. Your alternative is just to run a whole bunch of maps that have got 3 unique bosses on them, and then bottle up a whole bunch of them and then throw them all into blood-filled vessels and run maps that have got those blood-filled vessels in them. Then we have Hungering Harvest. When the league challenges were first announced, I looked at them, I thought this is probably the single worst one on the list because it requires you to kill a Shabi, who's a super rare boss, and it requires you to do multiple tier 4 harvest bosses, and then spend a fair bit of life force, which is very manageable. However, I was very wrong on that. The reason is that there is a new scarab that, whilst it's rare, it's not staggeringly rare. This is the Harvest Scarab of Cornucopia. If you map a lot, it will come, and once you've got it, it is going to be the solution here. The Harvest Scarab of Cornucopia seems to be about 1 in 1250 scarabs that drop if you don't have the node that makes uncommon scarabs more common, and if you've got that, it's going to be more frequent. All that said, I've been unlucky and I've got exactly 0 of them, although I have had rarer scarabs drop. The other advantage here, not only does this make it easier to get the individual harvest bosses, but it also makes it easier to get a Shabi. And if you're playing in Trade League, the Harvest Scarab of Cornucopia is only a couple dozen chaos, so this one's even easier to pick up there. One other thing I'll add, and this applies to all of these challenges, but it's probably most significant with the Harvest one where there's a scarab that really cheeses it, and that is that if you're willing to block other mechanics, you'll be able to bias the scarabs that you get in certain directions, and that's really useful for Hungering Harvests in particular. The next challenge is Eternal Exercising. This one is quite simple. It pretty much tells you what it does. All it requires you to do is loot and use 50 or more corpses that you acquire from either high yellow or red or purple tier maps. Now, if you're trying to craft yourself upgrades using the grave crafting system, you'll definitely get this. Alternately, if you're someone like me that just tends to sit on bad gear for a long time, or if you're playing a build that's got a lot of build defining uniques in a lot of different slots, you might find that this is not going to craft you things that are directly useful for your character, but it's going to be easy to do as soon as you try to anyway. Gravecrafts, after all, are very, very strong, even if they don't suit your character. Peddler's Produce 2 is next. Now, this is the much more complex of the Peddler's Produce ones. Again, this is all about vendor recipes, but this time the input items are going to be a fair bit harder to get. There are also different recipes that you can use for a bunch of these. So firstly, let's talk about that unique item. The best way to do this is to vendor the 4 different Agnorod staves. Not because the Agnorod staves are the easiest thing in the world to get, there's definitely easier ways to complete this, but the output for that recipe is the unique map, the Vinctar Square, and that's something you're going to need for a later challenge, so you may as well get it here. For an Orb of Fusing, you absolutely are required to vendor a 6-link item. If a Tabula drops for you, fantastic, that's your solution. Alternately, the Grave Crafting is really good at making 6 links, and sometimes you'll find yourself in a situation where a craft doesn't go the way you want it to, you end up with something really disappointing. Well, Peddler's Produce 2 is telling you to vendor a 6-link, and chances are by the time you're doing the vendor recipe for the Exalted Shard, you're going to have 6-link failures that you can vendor here. Alternately, there's a number of sources of corrupt items, which will also do this for you, especially if you're using a strongbox strategy or running certain types of Vile content. For an Exalted Shard, you need to vendor an item for every equipable item slot on your character. This does not include the trinket slot. You'll receive 2 Exalted Shards if all of those items are rare and they all have the same influence as each other. and this will be doubled to 4 Exalted Shards if the items are also unidentified. The easiest way to do this is either to farm the Shaper and Maven's Invitation the Formed, or Maven's Invitation the Twisted and the Elder, and then collect influenced items that drop from those bosses and the mini-bosses leading up to them, and then once you've got a set, vendor it for this challenge. Finally, for an influenced item, there's a few different recipes that you can use here. The easiest one of these is to take any influenced amulet and vendor it with a blue gem, a red gem, and a green gem. This recipe will then return an amulet that has the same influence type, but that is an onyx amulet instead of the old base, and it will be scoured, it won't have any mods on it. But there's a whole bunch of other things you can do here. Fun fact, I can name at least 2 vendor recipes that will get you both the unique item and the influenced item ones done at the same time. These are the vendor recipes for an influenced version of Dusk Dawn, or an influenced version of the Taming. Not particularly practical, but not all vendor recipes need to be. Generous Gravesites is next. Grinding games have a general policy that the further down the list of challenges you go, the more complex or the more difficult they tend to become. This one, however, is actually easier than the previous challenge that related to the endgame crafting basics. So this one requires you to use 10 crafting modifiers resulting in an item level 81 or higher item. So I look at that and say, oh, this is harder in every way than the previous one. The difference though is that Generous Gravesites allows you to have one craft that counts for multiple of the completions you need here, whereas the previous challenge does not. The previous one, each item that you craft only meets one of the different requirements, whereas for Generous Gravesites, you could conceivably get all 10 of them that you require, or even absolutely everything on the list, in one single grave craft if you wanted to. I'm actually not sure what's going on with reroll implicit or explicit modifier values. I know I've used that, and I'm certain it would have been on an item level 81 plus item, so I'm not sure why I don't have credit for completing that. That's an aside, maybe that one's bugged, but the rest of this is all trivial, so you'll definitely get it as soon as you're in red tier maps. Okay, so let's talk about the 2 that I would term very, very big grinds. Map Magnificence is the easier of the 2, Masterful Monsters is the uglier of the 2. There have been worse grindy ones in the past, but Masterful Monsters in particular is going to take quite a long time to beat. In trade, your best bet for Masterful Monsters is to team up with other players and do rotations. Each player brings their own Elver Temple, you just rush to the Omnitect, you kill it, and then you jump into the next person's temple and you kill their Omnitect. Alternatively, if you're in Trade League, you can just go on Delve. Ahuatotli is not super common to encounter, but every time you do find him, he's got a reasonably good chance of dropping his Val aspect, and last I checked that thing is 16 Divines and actually does sell at that price. So in trade, maybe that's the solution you go for. If you're in Solo Self-Found though, Omnitect is going to be the easiest way to do this, but it's going to take quite some time. This is going to take you 150 maps with Elver, but the thing is that Elver adds quite a bit of time to each map that you run, and of course you've then got to run the temple as well. If you're playing in SSF, Masterful Monsters is not on your path to 35, and it may not even be on your pathway to 38 challenges. As for Map Magnificence, the quickest way to do this is Foundry Map. The trick with Foundry Map is that once you know the layout, it's super quick. You load into the map, you never turn, you just run in a straight line, and the map boss is always there. It's a little way, but it's probably more like 15 or 20 meters, whereas in something like Strand, it's more like 50 or 55. Most leagues there's a Divination card challenge. Divine Destiny is the one for 3.24. Sometimes these have been really difficult, this one is not. I'm actually not going to suggest the easiest way to do that, that is to farm the Divination card, the Hoarder. Instead, you're going for something that's twice as rare, but a lot more useful to you, and that is the Divination card, the Fortunate. The Fortunate drops in a very large number of maps. I've burned a partial list of them into the video, there are others. One of the key things about it is that it gives you a very useful reward, 2 Divine Orbs. That buys a metamod if you're in SSF, and if you're in trade, it's the main currency for endgame trades. Next we have Remarkable Realms. This was a challenge with the same name and the same content in patch 3.18, and 19, and 20, and 21, and 22, and 23. I'm kind of getting sick of these maps. The thing you need to know here though is that if you're in Trade League, Ahuatotli the blind farming is really popular at the moment, and this has the effect of producing a lot of Doriani's Machinariums that flood the economy, and those things become cheap. They're a bit of a waste product of people trying to make the Adorned at the moment, and that's something that makes this challenge much less ugly than it's been in the past. You definitely don't need to look at paying 2 or 3 Divine Orbs for a single portal into Doriani's Machinarium like it's been in some previous leagues. Instead, you can get 6 portals to yourself for less than 2 Divines. The Vinctar Square is the other one we've already mentioned. You need to vendor all 4 Agnaron staves, Aggarod North, South, East and West in one transaction, and then you'll receive back the Vinctar Square. The drop rate for these staves was buffed in 3.19, it used to be quite rare, it's not anymore, and there's a Divination card that drops for them quite frequently in Strand maps. 3 of the other maps on this list are somewhat rare: the Twilight Temple, Coward's Trial, and Putrid Cloister. There is a trick to getting these though, and that is Kirak missions, and especially Kirak missions in conjunction with singular scouting reports or comprehensive scouting reports. Those will make it much easier. They're my recommendation to you if you play in solo self-found. If you're playing in Trade League though, doesn't really matter, you can buy those maps for a reasonable price. Next we have the two challenges that require some quite finicky knowledge about the way that the Necropolis modifiers on monsters work. When you open a map, you see the Lantern interface and you'll see that there's tier ratings for the different monsters. There'll be a Roman numeral 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7. These correspond to Servant, Peasant, Soldier, Gemling, Thaumaturgist, Noble, and Magistrate-Haunted respectively. Now the pain points for abnormal adversaries are Servant Haunted and Magistrate Haunted. These are the ones that are tiers 1 and 7 respectively. These will not spawn naturally in maps. The base range is tier 2 to tier 6. What you'll need is to pair something that is naturally tier 2 or naturally tier 6 with either a downwards pointing red arrow or an upwards pointing green arrow. This will allow you to take a tier 2 mod down to tier 1 or a tier 6 up to tier 7. The other thing you need to know is that not every mod has a range that includes tiers 1 and 7. So if one mod doesn't work, keep trying. It won't be that hard to get abnormal adversaries out of the way. Arimor's Apex though is something else. The problems with Arimor's Apex are several. You need to do this in non-trivial maps. They need to be at least tier 16 and they need to be at least 80% quantity. So that means that those maps are going to have fairly nasty mods on them already, and then the Magistrate-Haunted mods are mean as well. Then you need to run the map and actually have Magistrate-Haunted mods spawn in them, and every time you do that, there's probably only going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 rare monsters that are associated with that category type. For that reason, Arimor's Apex is secretly one of the nastiest challenges on the entire list. For a lot of players, Arimor's Apex is going to be your 40th challenge. For other players, it'll be your 39th or your 38th. The key thing you can do to speed this up considerably is to spec Imperial Wraiths at the bottom left corner of the passive tree. What Imperial Wraiths will do is it'll increase the tier of every single monster modifier that exists, every single Haunted modifier, by 1. This means you cannot get Servant Haunted mods at all, but it means you will start seeing Magistrate Haunted mods that have already rolled, and additionally there'll be Noble Haunted ones that you can upgrade to Magistrate Haunted as well. The Eternal Torment node in the top left of the passive tree also works here. That increases the chances of getting a rare monster in any given pack if it is Magistrate Haunted. That's the key thing you need to do to make Arimor's Apex reasonable at all, but even doing that, you're still going to need to do quite a lot of maps, because even with Imperial Wraiths and even with optimal placement of Haunted modifiers on the Lantern, many a map will not have any Magistrate Haunted monsters in it at all, and even the ones that do, you'll have a Magistrate Haunted pack, but you're not guaranteed any rare monsters even once you've got the packs. One thing you can do that helps with this is the Scarab from the Miscellaneous Scarabs category that causes you to have 4 additional packs of mirrored rare monsters. This can potentially give you additional rare monsters towards Arimor's Apex, and that's my plan in order to get this one done. Okay, so some fairly nasty ones out of the way, let's jump on to the one that's all about gems. Vigorous Virtue is pretty straightforward. Faceted lenses mostly come from the Labyrinth, so you might need to go back to the Labyrinth a couple of times. Likewise, transfigured gems, they're found from the Labyrinths as well. The Lapidary lens is the correct name of what players call a gem double corruption room. For a level 26, if you're in Trade League, the best way to do this is Crest of Desire because it will also cover the 51 quality, but Void Eye is a solution in solo self-found because it's common. In addition to that, you'll need to have a level 21 gem, which can drop from a fair number of mechanics now, and as well as that, one of these requires you just to get a level 21 gem through corruption anyway. For 51 quality, again, Crest of Desire is the best way if you're in Trade, but if you're not in Trade, Replica Void Eye gets the job done here as well. For 6 supports, your best bet is going to be to use Bitter Dream, which drops all the time, or Replica Bitter Dream, which drops quite a bit in Heist. As for leveling an Awakened Gem to level 5, you don't necessarily need to do this one because there are other options, but it's also not that difficult either. Even if you're playing in solo self-found, you'll probably get an Awakened Gem, even if it's not one that you can use, by the time that you're ready to fight both the Maven and the Uber Elder. And if it's completely useless to you, like if you're playing a cold damage build and you get Awakened Brutality, then you can just stick it in a weapon slot in your offhand and completely forget that you've got it. And then at some point in the future, you'll just get completion for this challenge anyway. The next challenge to discuss is cross-contamination, and this one's a bit more complex than some similar challenges have been in the past. Firstly, there's a couple of these that you might want to skip. You only need to do 4 and there's 6 options here. Possess Boss in Ritual is pretty easy. The trick here is to run the Shore map in conjunction with Ritual. The reason for this is that the Shore boss, when it's dropped under 50% and then again when it drops under 25%, it will disgorge a ghost. These ghosts will then try to get back into the same boss, or alternately into another rare or another unique monster if something appropriate is alive. Reasonably frequently though, they will run back into the map boss, and that's what you're looking for. You want to have a ritual where this boss spawns. Your ideal scenario is you go into a shore map, you ascertain that it's got rituals on it, you boss rush, you kill the boss, and then you run the 4 rituals. The first one, you might mess it up. The ghosts get away or they get into other monsters. The second one, you give it a shot and you die. Then you go back in for a third attempt and you're successful. Ultimately, it's not a very hard encounter if you know that this is the best spot in the game to do it. Otherwise, you'll need to run a lot of rituals in order to get a haunted ritual. Haunted rituals also disgorge a lot of ghosts, but these things are quite rare. The second one here is capture a beast that is holding an essence. This is something that was bugged in weeks 1 and 2 and actually wasn't possible to complete. That's now fixed, and so it's just a matter of RNG. If both of these mechanics are present on the map, there's a reasonably good chance that they will cross over and that you'll get everything done. Best thing is you can force both of these mechanics just with a single scarab each. For defeating a tier 4 harvest monster while delirious, almost every other league in the past, in fact every other league in the past, I would have said this is one to skip. This league, all you need is a 20% delirious map, it doesn't need to have any mods on it at all, and a harvest scarab of cornucopia. Congratulations, you've got yourself this challenge done. One very important thing to note is that those harvest bosses have minimum tiers, and so what I would do is run this in a tier 16 map so that you don't fall afoul of any minimum levels. The harvest scarab of cornucopia is very clear that it only spawns bosses that can exist there. For defeat a rogue exile that's possessed at least 3 times, my advice here is don't. There are easier options here. For defeat a blight boss while you're in a breach, my advice here is don't. There are easier options here. And to defeat a Stygian Spire while you're affected by a shrine, this one will honestly happen by accident while you're mapping, especially because the League mechanic will disgorge lesser shrines quite a bit, and All Flame Embers can force abysses onto maps as well. So if you use an All Flame Ember of Abyss, that's going to cause this to happen really easily. If you're in a map that's got shrines for any reason, you'll definitely get this one done. And of course, if you want to make this one easier, Abyss Scarabs, Domination Scarabs, use them together and you'll get this one by accident. It's not rare. Sanctified Scarabs 2 is one that I wanted to point out here as one that's really, really easy to do, but that you need to remember to do it. You also need to remember that you don't need to do all 18 here. Some of these combinations of Scarabs are very, very rare. However, enough of these are not rare that you'll have no trouble doing this by the time you run your 50th tier 16 map, if you just get around to actually going and doing it. Note that the maps that you apply the Scarabs to need to be at least 80% quantity and need to be at least tier 16. Formidable Flashbacks is very straightforward and very easy if you're in Trade League. Most of the memory lines only cost 5 to 10 chaos, so you can just buy a bunch of them and then run them all. However, if you're in solo self-found, these are somewhat rare, and so it can be quite a bit painful to get 6 to 8 of them to drop. Ultimately in SSF, this is RNG heavy, but it's RNG that will turn up by the time you hit level 95 on your first character. That said, you will not be able to do this before you hit level 90 in SSF. If you're sort of on the borderline and you don't quite have enough memory lines and you're getting near the end of your time in the league, this is probably not a bad time to use your excess Exalted Orbs if you're in solo self-found. Definitely use them on improving your gear first, but once you run out of Exalt targets, at that point, just getting an extra mod or 2 on a map you can reasonably easily beat with Formidable Flashbacks, that may well be a reasonable use of Exalted Orbs. Enigmatic Embers is next. This is one that was pretty mean when it was first released, but it's been made easier as the league has progressed. One of the buffs that took place was to make it so that All Flame Embers were much more common than they originally were. And honestly, I feel if Grinding Games were to release their challenges today, they'd probably have Enigmatic Embers goal be 250 rather than 100. But they released it when 100 was a fairly aspirational goal. It certainly isn't now, and so this one is actually fairly free. Note that some of the All Flame Embers are extremely, extremely dangerous. I'm thinking of you Tattoo ones, I'm thinking of you especially Omen ones. Those are much more dangerous than a lot of the others, but you can use those really sketchy embers on reasonably easy maps as long as they're tier 14 or above, and you'll get credit for this. If you want to go for maximum cheese, you can get a tier 14, 15 or 16 map that's scoured and that has a really smooth path to the boss, and just boss rush it. Of course, you don't need to do it the cheesy way, I just thought I'd point out that that is the easiest way to do this challenge. Aggravated Antagonists is next. Now this is going through a whole bunch of past league bosses. These are not created equally. Beyond Abyss, Omnitech, Delirium. All of these will happen with just minimal engagement with the relevant type of content, as long as you're engaging with that content at tier 16 and up. Now the rest of the bosses you're going to want to do. Katarina from the Syndicate, the Vox Twins, Chayula and the Expedition boss are going to be your next path of least resistance. The key thing with the Expedition bosses, they're only found in the logbooks, and additionally they can be really mean if you get a lot of mods on them, but if you make a beeline to the boss, they're all very easily defeated. It really is the remnant modifiers, and to a lesser extent the zone modifiers, i.e. the expedition version of map mods, those are the things that make those bosses difficult, and the expedition bosses show up 10% of the time in logbooks. The hardest to defeat here is probably the Delve boss, with Lycia a close second, and the hardest to reach are probably Ashabi, Trailmaster, Lycia, and Delve boss again. So really those are the 4 you're most likely to skip. Of course, if your character's super specialised, you might find that this difficulty order is off for you. Now we have Elevated Expanses. This is not on your pathway to 35, this may or may not be on your pathway to 38. It's probably on it, but it's probably the hardest challenge on your pathway to 38 for a lot of people. This is no joke at all. 50% pack size requires quite a bit of scaling of modifier effect in some situations, and that's a really, really fiendish stat. Once you start boosting that, maps get a lot nastier. Now if you're in Trade League, your path of least resistance for this challenge is to save up for a Headhunter. And I'm saying that completely seriously because Headhunter is the cheapest it's ever been, and it's never been close. Headhunter will allow you to borrow a large amount of power from the monsters that are present in the map, and then on top of that you can pick up even more borrowed power from shrines, and also from the Nico support on the Atlas, and then you can use that in order to then go and blast the map boss down if the map boss would normally be beyond you. I wouldn't normally suggest Headhunter as an option on a path of least resistance to challenges unless it was maybe to 40, but this league things are a bit different. This league, Headhunter is less than 10 divines, so that's your easiest approach. If you're in solo self-found, this one's going to be pretty monstrous. Just getting access to the requisite 30 maps in order to do this is going to be no small feat. That's going to take more than 100 tier 16 maps, potentially 200 or 300, depending upon the level of juice that you're using. And then, of course, you've still got to beat the tier 17s, and if you fail any of them, then that's going to be a setback there. In solo self-found, this is definitely mean. And next we have the one that I think is going to be the most common 40th challenge, Unfamiliar Undertakings. There are 2 of these challenges that are about hard bosses being completed in precision ways. The reason Unfamiliar Undertakings is harder than Colossal Conditionals is that Colossal Conditionals is about bosses that have been in the game for a long period of time. Unfamiliar Undertakings is new. Now for literally everything on this list, there is a simplest way to do it, and that is just simply more damage. Level a dedicated glass cannon boss killer. That is going to be your path of least resistance here. You might need to use another character to clear out the map and to make a pathway for this boss killer to come in, but then they just go in and they nuke the boss, and they don't let the boss think, they just obliterate it. That's the path of least resistance to beat Unfamiliar Undertakings. Nightmare of Katarina, Nightmare of Lycia, and Nightmare of Uhtred are probably the hardest 3 of these in order to do, and of those, the hardest one to beat is going to be the Nightmare of Uhtred, because he has 3 different telegraphed hits that all inflict Glimpse of Infinity, and they're all very, very fast and very tough to dodge. But the other ones are all much more reasonable. And speaking of precision boss kills, we have Colossal Conditionals. Did you make a glass cannon trapper for the last challenge? If so, Shaper, Cortex, Eater of Worlds, Searing Exarch. All of these can be done by a glass cannon build, and even if you don't get them the first try, you will get them fairly quickly. Note that for Uber Shaper in particular, it's actually the clone that's going to be what's going to trip you up here. You're going to quite often get into a spot where you've had a fight that's perfect, except that the clone clips you with its beam at some point. I do think the Uber Elder and Cirrus ones are quite hard here. They require you to be standing on specific bad ground at the time the boss dies, and the Maven one requires a very large amount of play skill in order to pull off. But the other ones are all very, very doable. One thing a lot of people don't realise is what the Wormhole Slam is. This is the move that the Cortex's 2nd and 4th boss use that teleport you to the boss, and then follow it up with a slam. You cannot dodge the teleport. What you need to do is make sure that you've got an instant movement skill that is ready to go as soon as you're hit by those black orbs. Once they've pulled you in and the Cortex slam is set off, you're on a very short time limit to teleport away before the slam goes off. That is a key objective to defeat the Cortex boss without being hit by Wormhole Slam. And finally we have Grueling Gauntlet Grinds. Everyone still refers to this as EGG because it used to always be called Endgame Grinds. This may actually be on your path of least resistance to 35 challenges this league, which is something that's not been the case, I think, pretty much ever before, and it's definitely on your path of least resistance to 38. So don't write this off just because it's the 40th challenge. It is not one of the hardest too. Parts 3 and 6 here are free. They come with natural gameplay if you're someone who plays a lot at endgame. Red tier maps with 8 modifiers, you'll definitely be running a bunch of these. Corpses in tier 16 maps, you'll get a phenomenal amount of these. For part 4, you need to focus on sourcing the maps. Running them is the easy part, sourcing them is the harder part. Here you're going to want to set up an Atlas tree around Destructive Play, the Maven-oriented keystone at the top, and that will make this a lot easier. You'll need more tier 16 maps than usual this league because you're going to have some of them upgrading to tier 17s, and you therefore get rewarded for having more tier 16s drop in general. And even though these are special tier 16s, when you run them, you get a bunch of 16s that again will upgrade to 17s. The Argus challenge is absolutely horrible. It is the antithesis of fun. It is really a mid-game grind. You're going and doing something that is really unfun and doing it a lot of times. I don't understand why grinding your games put it on here. However, it is on the path of least resistance. If you just want to get through this challenge, then what you want to do is wait for one day when the Labyrinth has Argus in the first room. This is an RNG thing, happens maybe once a fortnight, a little bit more frequently than once a fortnight. Matter of fact, while I was editing this video, I noticed that it's actually in the first room today. So if you're watching this on the same day of release and in the first few hours after this video goes live, then that's exactly where Argus is today. When it does, just go into the lab, go into the first room, kill Argus, leave. Kill Argus, leave. Kill Argus, leave. This is in the level 75 lab, so you'll need to pick up a whole bunch of offerings in advance. You do have two alternatives here though. The first one is Trade League only, and that is to defeat 50 Uber Pinnacle bosses. If you've got a good bosser, this is going to be very profitable for you. If you're in SSF though, this is going to require doing nearly 200 tier 17 maps, and so I don't think that's likely to be something you're going to want to do. Your alternative is to reach level 100, which just entails playing it safe and running a lot of content. Something that's important to note is that Domination Scarab of Teachings, which is one of the Shrine Scarabs, this is incredibly good for XP, and additionally the entire Abyss package is really solid for XP. Shrines are actually better, but when you're running the Shrine aspect you're going to be losing currency, whereas when you're running the Abyss approach you're going to be gaining it. Additionally, Betrayal is really good for XP, especially once you get tanky enough that you can survive making big mistakes on the Katarina fight. So Betrayal is another option if you want to reach level 100 and do it in maps. So those are the challenges in patch 3.24. If you've got any comments or questions, definitely fire away down below. Otherwise, I'm going to leave it there. May your Varlorbs have interesting results.